They laughed when the veteran dug into the mountain. But before the week was over, they were begging at his door, praying his dog had sensed danger in time. In the dead of winter, when the world turned white and roofs collapsed under the cold, only one place in Timber Ridge stayed warm. The underground shelter a lone veteran built with his loyal dog, a place mocked by everyone, until the storm came and proved them wrong. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The road into Timber Ridge was the same one Ethan Walker had traveled as a kid, but it felt narrower now, lonelier somehow, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. His truck crawled along the winding path, tires crunching over patches of leftover frost that refused to melt even in early fall. The sky was a sharp Montana blue, the kind that made your eyes ache if you stared too long. Beside him, Ranger sat perfectly still, ears perked, eyes scanning every movement in the tree line like they were both still overseas. Old habits, Ethan thought. Some habits didn't break. They just followed you home. The Walker family ranch appeared just past the ridge. The cabin slouched under the weight of weather and years of neglect. The roofline sagged, a corner shutter hung crooked, and the porch looked one good rainstorm away from surrender. Ethan pulled the truck to a stop and cut the engine.
For a moment, the silence felt louder than any battlefield he'd ever known. Ranger shifted beside him, letting out a soft whine, nudging Ethan's elbow with his nose as if reminding him to breathe. "I'm all right, buddy," Ethan murmured, though he wasn't sure it was true. He stepped out, boots hitting the dirt with a heaviness that had nothing to do with weight. Ranger jumped down beside him, tail low but alert, pacing a slow circle before returning to Ethan's side. The air smelled of pine resin, distant wood smoke, and something else. Memory. Ethan kept expecting to see his mother waving from the porch or his father stacking firewood by the shed. But the only thing that greeted him was wind whistling through a broken eave. He opened the cabin door. Dust rose in a soft cloud, catching the sunlight like drifting snow. The place was colder inside than out, as if the walls had forgotten how to hold warmth. Ranger trotted in and immediately sniffed every corner, mapping the room like he was searching for tripwires. Ethan set his duffel down and closed the door. The click of the latch echoed harder than it should have, tightening something in his chest. Night settled over Timber Ridge faster than Ethan remembered. By the time he lit the wood stove, the sky outside had darkened into a deep violet bruise. The fire sputtered, barely warming the room. He pulled his jacket tighter around him and sat on the edge of the old couch, elbows on his knees, hands clasped.
Ranger lay at his feet, but didn't sleep. He watched Ethan the way only a dog who had seen war could, quiet and steady, waiting. The first tremor hit without warning. A distant gust of wind rattled the window, and Ethan flinched before he could stop himself. The room seemed to shrink. The crackle of the fire twisted into something sharper in his mind. Mortar fire, the echo of debris raining down, Ranger barking through smoke. Ethan's breath hitched. He pressed his palms against his eyes. "Not now," he whispered, voice trembling against a memory he couldn't shut off. Ranger rose immediately, pressing his weight gently against Ethan's leg. It wasn't random comfort. The dog had been trained for this.
Ranger nudged Ethan's hands away from his face, leaning in until Ethan's breathing slowed, deepened, settled. Ethan wrapped an arm around Ranger's neck, grounding himself in the familiar warmth of the dog who had dragged him from rubble more than once. "Good boy," Ethan said softly. "I don't deserve you." Outside, the wind clawed at the cabin again, slipping through cracks in the walls and chilling the back of Ethan's neck. Winter wasn't here yet, but it was close. Too close. Ranger lifted his head, ears twitching. He sensed the cold coming the way he sensed everything, earlier, deeper, sharper than humans ever could. Ethan stood and walked to the window. From there, he could see the stretch of land his parents once kept alive, fences falling apart, fields grown wild, timber stacked and forgotten near the tree line. A place that used to be home, now little more than bones left out in the weather. "This house won't make it through another winter," Ethan said to no one, though Ranger's ears flicked in response. He wasn't wrong. The cold in the walls didn't feel like neglect. It felt like a warning. Ranger moved to stand beside him, leaning gently against his leg. Ethan let out a long, tired breath. "I guess it's just you and me now," he said. In the reflection of the window, Ranger's steady amber eyes watched him, full of loyalty that didn't need words. Outside, the cold crept closer.
Inside, Ethan felt the weight of everything he'd lost, and the fragile beginning of something he wasn't sure he could name yet. Not hope, not yet, but maybe the space where hope could someday fit. "Yeah," he whispered, resting a hand on Ranger's head. "We'll figure it out." The wind howled across Timber Ridge, carrying the first hint of the brutal season waiting just beyond the mountains. Ethan stood there listening, unaware that this winter would test every scar he carried, and that the dog beside him would become the reason strangers lived to tell the story. By the time night settled in for good, the temperature had fallen sharply. The cabin's thin walls groaned under the pressure of the cold creeping through every crack and seam.
Ethan fed another log into the wood stove, watching the flames struggle before finally catching, flickering with a weak, inconsistent glow. He rubbed his hands together, trying to chase the numbness from his fingers. Ranger circled twice near the stove, then lay down, though he kept his eyes open. He sensed something Ethan didn't, something in the air itself. A tension, a warning. Ethan felt it too, though his body translated it differently. His spine stayed rigid, his breathing shallow, old instincts rising whenever the wind rattled the windows like distant impacts. The cabin was supposed to be home, yet it felt like a stranger wearing his memories in all the wrong ways. He tried to lie down, pulling the thin quilt over himself on the old couch.
Ranger hopped up beside him, pressing his warm body against Ethan's ribs. For a moment, the simple weight of the dog felt like an anchor keeping him from drifting back into the places he avoided. But when the wind slammed hard against the northwest corner of the house, something deep in Ethan seized. The sudden noise cracked through the silence like a blast wave. Ethan sat bolt upright, heart hammering. Ranger reacted instantly, nosing Ethan's shoulder, leaning against him, letting out short, controlled breaths the way he'd been trained to do during overseas deployments. Ethan clutched at the dog's fur, grounding himself in the here and now. "It's just the wind," Ethan murmured, though his voice shook. "Just the wind." But it wasn't just the wind. It was the cabin, too. Hollow, weak, failing. The cold pushed through the floorboards, crawled under the doorframe, slid down from the rafters like invisible ice. Ranger shivered even with his thick coat, and Ethan knew then, without question, that this place would not keep them alive when the real winter arrived. Sleep came in thin, broken pieces. Every time Ethan drifted off, memories snaked their way into the fragile quiet. A night in Afghanistan when the temperature plummeted, and the unit had huddled in a bombed-out building with no roof. The sound of wind whistling through shattered concrete had mimicked the sound of mortar fins cutting the air. Back then, Ranger pressed himself against Ethan's side in the same protective stance he used now.
Just before dawn, Ethan jolted awake again. This time not from a nightmare, but from the cold biting into his bones. Frost had formed inside the window panes. He sat up, exhaling a breath that fogged in front of him. Ranger stood and nuzzled his hand, urging him toward the stove. "Yeah, buddy," Ethan whispered, voice hoarse. "We need more heat." He opened the wood stove to find only embers glowing weakly at the bottom. He hadn't slept long, yet long enough for the warmth to fade away. He gathered more logs from the corner, but as he placed them in the stove, he noticed the faint crackle of snow sliding off the roof. Too early in the season for comfort. After warming himself a bit, he moved through the cabin, checking the walls, corners, and seams with a tired soldier's practicality. Cold seeped through everywhere. The insulation had rotted. The firewood pile was smaller than he remembered. Even if he spent every waking minute prepping, he wouldn't cure the cabin's deeper problems. "This place isn't going to last," he muttered. Ranger whined softly, as if agreeing. Ethan stepped out onto the porch. The early morning sky glowed pink over the mountains, but the air felt brutal. He wrapped his coat tight and surveyed the land. His parents' old barn leaning sideways, the woodshed sagging, the fields brittle and brown. "So this is what I came home to," he said under his breath. Just then, the wind shifted. Ranger stiffened beside him, ears pricking sharply. The dog stared toward the tree line as if spotting something Ethan couldn't. Then Ranger let out a low growl. Not aggressive, just uneasy. "What is it?" Ethan asked. Ranger's tail lowered. He didn't move closer to the trees, but he didn't look away either. Ethan scanned the ridge. Nothing out of place. No animals. No threats. But he'd learned long ago that Ranger didn't react without cause. "Cold like this," Ethan whispered, rubbing his hands together. "It's only going to get worse." He returned inside, sealing the door behind them. Ranger followed, still glancing back at the ridge before settling near Ethan again. The dog leaned his head against Ethan's knee, and Ethan stroked his fur slowly. "We're not going to make it in this house," Ethan said. "Not like this." Ranger blinked, steady and calm.
Ethan took a deep breath, inhaling the musty air of the cabin that had once meant safety. He exhaled slowly, his breath turning to fog. Maybe the world expected him to patch the roof, chop more firewood, hope the cold spared them out of mercy. But hope wasn't a plan. He'd been taught that a long time ago. And as he watched frost creep along the inside of the walls, Ethan understood something with chilling clarity. If he wanted to survive this winter, if Ranger was going to make it through, he would have to build something stronger than memories and broken boards. He would have to build something the cold couldn't touch.
The decision began forming right then, in the quiet blue light of morning, as Ranger rested his head on Ethan's leg, and the wind whispered its icy warning across Timber Ridge. They had come home to a house, but they would need to build a shelter. The morning light cut through the cabin's frosted windows like thin blades, catching the dust in the air and scattering it in golden fragments. Ethan stood in the doorway with his coat half zipped, staring at the barren stretch of land behind the house. Ranger stood beside him, ears perked, tail still. The dog sensed a shift in Ethan. Not fear this time, but resolve. Ethan stepped out into the cold, boots crunching on the thin crust of frost that had formed overnight. His breath curled out in front of him like smoke. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable. It was invasive, creeping into his bones, reminding him how unprepared he truly was. Ranger trotted ahead, scanning the area with practiced precision. Ethan approached the small rise behind the cabin, the same spot his father once used for storing tools and lumber. Now it was little more than a slope of packed dirt swirled with weeds and dried roots. But something about it felt right. Maybe it was the angle of the sun. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the memory of nights spent in tactical bunkers overseas, where the earth above your head meant one thing: survival. Ranger sniffed around the base of the slope, then suddenly stopped. His body stiffened. He pawed at the ground once, twice, then began digging with a steady rhythm.
"What is it, boy?"
Ethan asked, dropping to a knee. Warm air rose from the disturbed soil, just faintly, but enough for a trained soldier to notice. A pocket of insulated ground, dry, compact, stable. If there was a place to build underground, this was it. Ethan glanced at Ranger. "Good nose," he murmured. "This might actually work." He stood, scanning the hill as if seeing it not for what it was, but for what it could become. A shelter with walls of earth, steady temperatures, no wind tearing at the seams. A place where the cold couldn't find them. He felt something he hadn't felt in months, maybe years. Purpose. Ethan returned to the cabin, grabbed a shovel, and headed back to the hill. The first strike into the frozen soil jolted through his arms. The second sank deeper, cracking through a layer of stubborn clay. He worked with a quiet determination, the kind that came from years of pushing past pain and exhaustion. Ranger lay nearby, watching him with alert, steady eyes. "You and me, buddy," Ethan said between breaths. "We're building a future." But as the hours passed, quiet wasn't what he got. A truck engine rumbled up the gravel road, stopping just beyond the fence. Ethan didn't turn around. He didn't need to. The heavy footsteps, the exaggerated sigh, the faint smell of tobacco. It could only be one person. Mark Jensen. "So it's true," Mark called out. "You really are digging." Ethan didn't respond. He kept working, the shovel sinking into the earth with a dull thud. Mark stepped closer, boots crunching.
What is this, Walker? A bunker? A panic hole? You expecting the Russians to roll through Montana? Ethan straightened slowly, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and planted the shovel in the ground. Just building something that'll keep us warm. Mark snorted. "It's a hole in the dirt. You've been back what? A week? And already you're out here acting like the world's ending." Ethan's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "Winters here are getting worse. The cabin can't take another one." "Oh, come on. People survive winter every year. You just don't know how to live out here anymore." Ranger stepped between them, positioning himself slightly ahead of Ethan, his stance protective. His gaze locked onto Mark with a silent warning.
Mark raised his hands in surrender, backing up half a step. "Easy, boy. No trouble here," he muttered. Ethan put a hand on Ranger's back. "We're done talking." Mark shook his head, letting out a laugh that held more mockery than humor. "Fine, but when that hill collapses on your head, don't expect the town to dig you out." He left without another word. Ethan exhaled slowly, fighting the familiar tightening in his chest. Ranger pressed gently against his leg, sensing the tension building inside him. "I'm fine," Ethan whispered. "Let's keep going." But the truth was, he wasn't fine. His mind flickered back to the desert, collapsed buildings, shouts, falling debris, the sting of dust in his lungs. Ranger had dragged him out of a cave-in once, pulling him by the strap of his vest while mortar rounds chewed the earth behind them. Now, as he dug into the Montana hillside, the sound of metal scraping soil sent sparks of memory flashing behind his eyes. He forced himself to breathe. In, out. In, out. Ranger nudged him once, steadying the rhythm. The digging continued, slow, exhausting, painful in all the old ways. Every few minutes, Ethan paused to steady his breath, letting Ranger bring him back to the present. He ignored the glances from passing drivers. He ignored the whispers of unstable veteran drifting from the Jensen property. He ignored the ache in his shoulders and the burn in his lungs.
By midday, He had carved a shallow trench. Nothing impressive yet, but it was a beginning. He stood at the edge, chest heaving, staring at what he'd created. Ranger walked to the trench, sniffed it, then looked at Ethan with bright, expectant eyes. "Yeah," Ethan said softly. "It's not much, but it's ours." He picked up the shovel again. The wind carried faint laughter from somewhere down the ridge. Neighbors watching, judging, misunderstanding. Their voices dissolved into the rustle of dry pine needles and the steady scrape of Ethan's shovel. He didn't need their approval. He needed a shelter. He needed to survive. And with Ranger by his side, he would. But Timber Ridge had a way of reminding a man just how small he was, especially when the wrong people were watching.
By the next morning, word had spread across the valley. Ethan didn't need to check his phone or talk to anyone to know it. The signs were everywhere. The way a truck slowed as it passed, the faint echo of laughter carrying on the wind, the unmistakable feeling of eyes lingering too long on his land. Ethan shoveled into the hillside with steady force, each strike deliberate. Ranger lay a few feet behind him, paws crossed, tail flicking whenever someone approached the fence line. The dog didn't bark. He didn't need to. His presence alone made most folks hesitate before getting too close. Most folks, but not all. Just before noon, a battered blue pickup rolled up to the edge of the property. Mark Jensen swung out of the driver's seat, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. He chewed the end of a toothpick, hat tilted back on his head, wearing that half smirk he used whenever he thought he was about to deliver wisdom no one asked for. "Well, I'll be damned," Mark said loud enough for half the county to hear. "You're still at it." Ethan didn't turn. "Morning, Mark." "This ain't morning work," Mark shot back. "This is, what do they call it? Panic digging. End of the world stuff." Ranger rose to his feet, moving to stand between Ethan and Mark. His body was stiff but calm, alert without being threatening. Ethan placed a hand on Ranger's neck, grounding them both. "I said it yesterday," Mark continued. "You're digging your own grave." Ethan rested the shovel, leaning on its handle. He studied the half-formed trench, the exposed clay, the space he imagined would someday protect him and Ranger from the worst winter Montana could throw at them. "You done?" Ethan asked quietly. "For now," Mark shrugged. "Just don't want to see you do something stupid. Folks around here talk, you know." "I know. And they're saying the war didn't just scar you, it scrambled you." Ranger growled, low and warning. Ethan tightened his grip on the dog, but didn't look away from Mark. "You've had your say," Ethan replied. "Now let me work." Mark chuckled, sharp, dismissive, and headed back to his truck. Before climbing in, he called out, "You ever decide to come back to your senses? We could use a hand at the ranch." Ethan didn't answer. Mark didn't wait for one. As the truck rumbled away, Ranger pressed himself lightly against Ethan's leg, offering that silent reassurance only a service dog could give. Ethan exhaled slowly, letting the tension bleed out. "That's just how he is," Ethan murmured. "We're not here for him." But Timber Ridge wasn't done with him yet. By late afternoon, another visitor arrived. A sheriff's cruiser easing up the driveway. Sheriff Collins stepped out, adjusting his jacket, his breath fogging in the crisp air. He wasn't a bad man, not by any stretch. But he had a look about him that morning, a mixture of caution and concern. He approached slowly. "Ethan?" "Sheriff?" "Mind if I ask what you're doing out here?" Ethan tapped the shovel against his boot. "Digging." "I can see that." Collins lifted his chin toward the growing pit. "Question is, What for? Shelter. Collins scratched his cheek. You planning on living underground? Planning on surviving, Ethan replied. Ranger sat beside him like a sentry. Collins sighed. Look, word's going around. Some folks think maybe you came back too soon. Maybe you should have stayed with the VA longer. You've been through a lot. Ethan tensed, not from anger, but from the familiar sting of being misunderstood. I know what I'm doing, he said. And I'm not saying you don't. But you scare people when you isolate yourself like this. Especially with, you know. Collins nodded subtly toward Ranger.
A trained combat dog makes folks nervous. He's not the one people should worry about, Ethan replied evenly. Collins held up a hand. I'm not here to cause trouble, just checking in. That's all. Ethan softened slightly. I appreciate that. Fine. Collins stepped back toward his cruiser. Just promise me you won't do anything risky. Ethan looked at the hillside, then at the fragile cabin behind him. Not doing this would be risky. Collins had no answer for that. After the sheriff left, Ethan returned to his work. But he wasn't alone for long. A group of local teenagers wandered up the slope near his property line, laughing loudly. One pointed at the trench, another mimed digging. A third tossed a soda can over the fence, including a quiet apology Ethan barely heard.
Ranger barked once. Not aggressive, just commanding. The teens scattered like startled deer. Ethan rubbed Ranger's ears. That's enough, they're just kids. But even as he said it, a deeper ache settled in his chest. Not from the work, not from the cold, from the humiliation. The constant eyes, the judgment he couldn't outrun no matter how far he was from the war. Still, he picked up the shovel again. He dug until his arms trembled, until sweat ran cold down his spine, until the sun dipped low behind the ridge and the sky turned the color of fading embers. By the time he stopped, Ethan stood in a trench nearly waist deep. It didn't look like much to anyone else, but to him, it was the beginning of safety, stability, life. He climbed out slowly, gripping Ranger's fur for balance. The dog steadied him with quiet strength. I know they think I'm crazy, Ethan whispered, but they're not the ones freezing at night. Ranger leaned against him, a warm weight in the gathering dark. The valley winds rose again, colder than the night before, warning him of what lay ahead. Ethan looked at the half-built shelter, then toward the silhouette of the mountains swallowing the last of the light. They'll laugh, he said. Let them. But the chill that crawled through the air carried something sharper than mockery. It carried the promise of the first storm. And it was coming faster than anyone in Timber Ridge realized. By dawn the next morning, clouds were settling low over the mountains, thick, heavy, the color of old steel. A cold wind pushed through the valley, sharper than before, cutting across the land like a warning only a few could hear. Ethan worked through it anyway. He spent hours reinforcing the trench walls, hauling pine beams salvaged from the collapsed shed, measuring the angle of the hillside the way he once measured distances under enemy fire. Ranger stayed close, pacing, sniffing, watching every shadow as if danger lived in the wind itself. By midday, Ethan had maneuvered a long support beam toward the edge of the trench. It was heavy, heavier than he expected, and his left shoulder throbbed with the deep ache that came from an old injury he rarely talked about. Ranger sensed it immediately, nudging him with concern. I'm fine, Ethan muttered, though he wasn't.
He braced himself, lifted the beam, and maneuvered it into position. But as he tilted it upward, the beam slipped. Ethan tried to correct it, but the shifting weight jerked violently, pulling him off balance. The trench walls vibrated as loose dirt fell in a thin cascade. Then, with a sickening crack, another beam, one he had rested temporarily against the wall, shifted and slid. Ethan barely had time to look up. A dark shape lunged toward him. Ranger. The dog grabbed Ethan's jacket sleeve with his teeth, yanking backward with every ounce of strength in his body. The slipping beam crashed down, missing Ethan's skull by inches and slamming into the dirt where he had been standing a heartbeat earlier. Ethan hit the ground hard, breath knocked out of him.
The trench echoed with the dull thud of falling soil. For a moment, all he heard was the pounding of his pulse. Ranger was on him instantly, paws planted firmly, pressing against Ethan's chest, breathing in slow, rhythmic bursts, the way he had been trained to calm soldiers during combat distress. Ethan's vision flickered. Not the trench, not Montana, but a collapsed building in Syria. Dust choking the air, the ringing in his ears. Ranger pulling him out by the vest strap while the world shook and crumbled. He sucked in a sharp breath, fighting the memory. Ranger lowered his head, nudging Ethan's chin. "I'm okay," Ethan whispered, though his voice trembled. "I'm okay." He lay there until his heartbeat settled. The cold air stung his lungs, but it grounded him. The present. Ranger's weight. The Montana sky overhead. When he finally pushed himself upright, he brushed dirt off his jacket and looked at the beam lying across the trench floor. 1 inch, and everything could have ended. Ranger sat directly in front of him, tail still, eyes locked on his. "You saved my life again, buddy," Ethan murmured, his voice rough. "Just like before." Ranger pressed his head into Ethan's chest, and Ethan let his hand rest on the dog's back. For a long, quiet moment, they stayed like that. Man and dog, anchored in a bond forged far from home. Eventually, Ethan stood. His legs wobbled, but his resolve didn't. He hauled the fallen beam out of the trench, more careful now, more aware of how close he'd come to disaster. But Timber Ridge wasn't finished testing him. Around mid-afternoon, the sound of an engine drifted across the property. Ethan turned as a beat-up SUV rolled to a stop by the fence. The Olsen brothers, teenagers with more attitude than sense, stepped out, laughing as they approached. "Hey, Walker!" the taller one called. "Still building that mole hole of yours?" The shorter brother snorted. "Bet he thinks winter's gonna come alive and chase him underground." Ethan tightened his grip on the shovel, but said nothing. Ranger, however, stood tall, muscles braced, tail straight. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply existed in that quiet, powerful stance that made both boys stop mid-laugh. Easy there," the taller one muttered. Ethan stepped between them. "You boys need something?" "No," the shorter one said quickly. "Just checking things out." "Well, you've seen them. Now go." The boys backed away, retreating faster than they arrived. Ranger watched them leave before returning to Ethan's side, brushing gently against his leg. "They'll talk about this all week," Ethan said softly. "About the crazy vet and his war dog." The wind picked up again, swirling dust and flakes of early snow. Ethan looked at the trench, unfinished, uneven, but growing. Every inch was a fight. Every step forward pulled at memories he spent years trying to bury. He lifted another beam, testing its weight. His muscles ached, his shoulder throbbed, his breath came out white. But he kept going. Ranger stood guard through it all, calm, vigilant, ready. By late afternoon, Ethan's hands were blistered. Dirt clung to his face.
The trench looked deeper, stronger, more defined. He leaned on his shovel, breathing hard as he stared down the length of it. "You almost lost me today, boy," Ethan whispered. "But you didn't." Ranger nudged his leg again. The sky darkened earlier than usual. Snowflakes drifted down, slow at first, then faster, swirling in the wind. Ethan glanced toward the mountains, sensing something building. A storm was coming. Maybe not the storm, but something big enough to push him forward with new urgency. He gathered his tools and headed toward the cabin, Ranger trotting beside him. At the doorway, Ethan paused, looking back at the fresh beams and the yawning trench. "Not a grave," he whispered. "A shelter. Our shelter." Ranger barked once, short and sure, as if agreeing.
Inside, the cold seeped in through the walls again, sharper than the night before. Ethan sat heavily on the couch, running a tired hand through Ranger's fur. The dog rested his head on Ethan's lap, eyes steady, warm, loyal. Outside, the wind howled louder, and deep in his bones, Ethan knew they were running out of time. But they weren't running alone. By the following morning, the world outside had shifted again. The clouds sat low and unmoving over Timber Ridge, thick as wool and heavy with unfallen snow. The air felt dense, like something was pressing down on the valley from above. Ethan stepped out of the cabin with Ranger at his side, and immediately his breath turned to fog. Ranger froze halfway down the porch steps.
His body stiffened, tail straightening, chest rising in a silent inhale as he scanned the tree line. Every hair along his back lifted one by one, like tiny antennae sensing something Ethan couldn't yet understand. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked softly. Ranger didn't look back. He stared toward the northern ridge, unblinking. Then he let out a low, rolling growl, deep, steady, not from aggression but from instinct. A warning. Ethan followed Ranger's gaze, but the ridge looked no different than usual. Tall pines dusted with white. The rocky slope cutting down toward the valley. Shadows pooling at the base where the forest grew thick. Nothing unusual. But Ranger wasn't wrong. Ethan had learned that over and over again.
A dog trained to detect bombs, ambushes, weather shifts, even human distress. They didn't guess. They sensed. They remembered things their human partners sometimes missed. Ethan knelt beside him. "Tell me what you know." Ranger didn't bark. Instead, he lifted his nose higher, sniffing the air. The wind pushed against them, carrying a faint whistle that wasn't normal. Not quite howling, not quite humming. Something in between. Ethan felt the tension settle deep in his chest. He rose slowly. "Another storm?" Ranger gave a single short rumble. Ethan didn't know much about the weather patterns in Timber Ridge anymore. The years away had changed the land as much as they had changed him. But he knew one thing. A storm strong enough to unsettle Ranger wasn't just a cold front.
It was something bigger. He grabbed his gloves, shovel, and the axe leaning against the porch. Ranger followed, sticking close, but his head kept turning toward the ridge, watching, listening. The day's digging began with urgency. Ethan drove the shovel into the earth harder than usual, pulling up clumps of clay and frozen soil. His muscles burned, but he didn't slow down. He reinforced the entrance tunnel, checking the growing chamber beneath the hill with a soldier's eye, looking for weaknesses, potential collapses, places where weight might shift. Ranger remained on alert, patrolling the edges of the worksite. Occasionally, he circled back toward Ethan, bumping him gently with his nose to redirect him away from a spot that felt unstable.
Twice, he positioned himself between Ethan and the trench wall. Ethan listened every time. Around noon, the wind shifted again, not colder, but sharper, slicing down from the mountains like a blade. Ranger stiffened mid-step, ears angling forward. Then he barked. Once. Loud. Commanding. Ethan stopped digging and looked up. What is it? Ranger trotted to the tree line, then back toward Ethan, then toward the trench again, as if trying to guide him away from something. A warning loop. What are you sensing? Ethan whispered. The dog's tail lowered. His mouth closed tight. His eyes stayed fixed on the shadows moving under the pines. Ethan grabbed his coat and climbed out of the trench. He scanned the ridge again, but nothing moved. No animals, no wind sweeping through the branches.
No snow falling. Just silence. Heavy and loaded. Then a faint rumble drifted through the valley. Not thunder, not a truck on the highway. Something softer, farther, like the mountain exhaled. Ranger backed up 2 steps, pressing his shoulder against Ethan's leg. This wasn't fear. This was instinct. The same instinct that had saved Ethan's life countless times overseas. A cold tremor ran down Ethan's spine. He knelt and placed a steady hand on Ranger's neck. "All right," he murmured. "I hear you." They returned to the trench, but Ethan's pace had changed. He dug slower, more carefully, listening between each stroke of the shovel. The ground felt firmer in some areas, too soft in others. He made mental notes of where to reinforce the beams, where to widen the space.
Where Ranger hesitated. By mid-afternoon, the sky had gone from steel gray to bruised purple. The first flakes of snow floated down, not many, not heavy, but enough to hint at something larger behind them. Ethan climbed out of the trench and stretched his aching shoulders. Ranger sat at the edge, watching him with deep amber eyes that reflected the dimming light. "We're racing the weather," Ethan said. "And losing." Ranger let out a short whine. Just then, a pair of headlights appeared on the road. A sedan rolled to a stop near the fence, and Linda Sharp, who ran the general store, stepped out, bundled in a thick green coat. She waved awkwardly. "Ethan, everything all right out here?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Just working." Linda glanced at the trench, frowning. "People in town are worried about you." Ranger walked between them, not hostile, just cautious. Linda smiled gently at the dog. "Afternoon, Ranger." Ranger blinked but didn't respond. Linda stepped closer to Ethan. "Sheriff Collins said the Weather Service is watching a cold cell forming over the ridge. They don't think it'll be much, but—" She hesitated. "Animals have been acting strange all morning." Ethan's pulse tightened. "What kind of strange?" "Restless, skittish. Horses refusing to leave the barn. Coyotes quiet." She looked at Ranger. "And if he's acting jumpy too, maybe you should come into town. Stay above ground." Ethan shook his head. "This cabin won't survive a hard freeze. If something's coming, this shelter is our best chance." Linda sighed, concern etched into her face. "You've been through a lot, Ethan. Don't let the past make you see danger where there isn't any." Ethan knelt beside Ranger again. The wind brushed past them, carrying a faint hiss that almost sounded like whispering snow. "I wish I were imagining it," he said quietly. "But Ranger never guesses, and I've learned the hard way not to doubt him." Linda studied the two of them. The veteran crouched beside the dog, who watched the mountains as if reading a language only he understood. After a moment, her expression softened. "Just be careful," she said. "People are talking, but that doesn't mean they want anything bad to happen to you." When she drove away, the valley fell silent again. Ethan placed both hands on Ranger's shoulders. "It's coming, isn't it?" Ranger pressed his forehead gently against Ethan's chest. Not fear, not warning. Reassurance. Ethan looked up at the darkening sky, snow swirling around them in tiny spirals. "All right," he whispered. "Then we keep going." As the light faded and the first hints of night settled in, Ethan returned to the trench, reinforced the beams, and prepared for the days ahead. Ranger never left his side, not once, not even as the cold deepened and shadows stretched across the land like long, reaching fingers. The wind no longer carried just the promise of winter. It carried the breath of a storm that only Ranger truly understood. By the next morning, the sky had turned the color of bruised slate. Not a bird moved in the air. Not a squirrel rustled through the trees. The silence across Timber Ridge felt unnatural, like the land itself was holding its breath. Ethan stepped out of the cabin with Ranger close behind. The air bit at his skin, sharp enough to sting. Ranger's ears were already up, his body stiff with a tension Ethan recognized too well. Anticipation mixed with unease. But Timber Ridge didn't care about warnings or instincts. People cared about what they could see, and what they saw was a man digging a hole in the side of a hill while winter crept closer. Ethan returned to the shelter site and began reinforcing the support beams. Ranger patrolled the perimeter, occasionally stopping to stare toward the north ridge, where the clouds hung low and heavy. Ethan noticed. "Still worried about that ridge, huh?" Ranger didn't look away. But before Ethan could comment further, the sound of crunching gravel carried across the yard. A truck pulled up, bigger and louder than any that had visited recently. Ethan recognized it immediately. Mark Jensen. And he wasn't alone. 3 other men climbed out, all of them from neighboring ranches. Good men in their own ways, but right now their eyes held amusement, not empathy. "Well, boys," Mark announced, clapping his gloved hands together. "Looks like the legend is true. The veteran really is digging himself a foxhole for winter." The others laughed, short, sharp bursts that echoed across the frozen hillside. Ethan rested his shovel in the dirt and stood straight. "Morning." Mark looked down at the shelter entrance, then back at Ethan. "Morning? You call this morning? This looks like a midlife crisis with a shovel." More laughter. Ranger moved beside Ethan, standing tall, ears angled forward. His muscles tightened, but he remained silent, alert without aggression, protective without hostility. Mark lifted a brow. "Careful now. Don't sick your dog on us." Ethan's jaw clenched. "Ranger doesn't attack unless someone threatens me." "Well," Mark said, gesturing around the site, "we're just here for the show. Folks down in town are taking bets on whether you hit gold or lose your mind first." One of the men whistled. "I heard his cabin's falling apart. Maybe he's building himself a burial chamber." Ethan felt the sting, not because the words were cruel, but because they echoed the doubts he whispered to himself in the quiet hours of the night. Ranger sensed the tension and pressed lightly against his leg, grounding him. "I'm building something to survive the winter," Ethan said. "That's all." Mark snorted. "Winter comes every year. Most of us get through it without turning into groundhogs." Ethan took a slow breath, fighting the old instinct to stand in confrontation, feet squared, ready to defend. Ranger picked up on that shift and nudged Ethan's thigh as if reminding him, "You're not there anymore. You're home. This is different." "I don't expect you to understand," Ethan said quietly. "No," Mark replied. "You don't expect anyone to understand. Because you think you know something the rest of us don't." Another man chimed in. "He's been talking to that dog too much." Ranger's ears twitched. He didn't like the tone. Ethan stepped forward. "That dog saved my life. More than once." One of the men muttered, "Here he goes with the war stories again." Mark smirked and lifted his hands. All right. No need to get jumpy. Just checking in on our favorite veteran. Making sure you haven't dug yourself to China yet. Ethan stared at him, cold and unblinking. Are you done? Mark paused, squinting as if evaluating Ethan for the first time. Ranger's posture, Ethan's steady gaze, the growing storm behind them. It all made the air feel heavier. Yeah, Mark said after a beat. I'm done. The group turned back to their truck, but not before one looked over his shoulder and muttered, "Man's lost it." Ethan waited until the engine faded down the road before lowering himself onto a wooden log. Ranger sat beside him, leaning his warm weight against Ethan's hip. He rubbed Ranger's head. Sorry you had to hear that. Ranger rested his chin on Ethan's leg, a small, quiet gesture that said more than words ever could. You're not alone. Ethan stared at the trench, the beams, the walls he had carved with his own hands. What looked like madness to others looked like protection to him. A future, a plan. But the humiliation lingered like frostbite, slow, creeping, painful. He stood again, forcing the emotion down.
What mattered wasn't their opinions. What mattered was the work, the shelter, the instinct, the one that lived in his gut and sharpened each time Ranger growled at the wind. By late afternoon, the sky dimmed again, though the sun wasn't yet gone. The valley felt darker, quieter. Ranger stayed tense, tail low, eyes narrowed toward the north ridge. Then a sound rolled across the mountains, deep, distant, almost like the tremor of shifting snow far above the tree line. Ranger snapped to attention. Ethan froze. The sound faded as quickly as it came. If Ranger hadn't reacted, Ethan might have dismissed it as nothing. But Ranger never reacted to nothing. Ethan knelt, gripping the dog's shoulders.
What do you know that I don't, buddy? Ranger's eyes flicked toward the ridge, then back to Ethan. A soft whine escaped him, not fear, but insistence. The storm wasn't just coming, it was watching them. Another gust of icy wind tore across the valley, lifting dust and brittle snowflakes. Ethan shivered and glanced back at the unfinished shelter. We're close, he whispered, but not close enough. Ranger pressed into him again, warm and unwavering. Ethan stood tall, grabbed his shovel, and returned to work with renewed urgency. He dug faster, deeper, stronger. Each shovel of earth thrown aside carried his frustration, his fear, and his resolve. Let them laugh. Let them talk. Let them doubt. Because when the storm arrived, as Ranger insisted it would, Ethan knew exactly where he and his dog needed to be. And this time, he wouldn't be caught unprepared. By dawn, a strange stillness settled over Timber Ridge. The air didn't move. The trees didn't sway. Even the clouds seemed frozen in place, pressed low and heavy against the mountains. It was the kind of silence that made every creature pause, waiting, sensing, bracing. Ranger felt it first. He paced the porch, nails clicking against the old wood, his breath turning to fog even though the day had barely begun. His ears twitched at sounds Ethan couldn't hear. His head snapped toward the ridge more than once, muscles taut, fur standing on end. Ethan stepped outside with a thermos of steaming coffee, eyes squinting at the sky. Feels wrong out here, he murmured. Ranger didn't answer, just stood beside him, staring north. Then the temperature dropped. Not gradually, not naturally, in an instant. A cold so sudden and sharp it punched the breath out of Ethan's lungs. He gasped, clutching the porch railing as his breath crystallized mid-air. What in the... Before he could finish the thought, a distant roar rose from the mountains. Low at first, like the groan of shifting ice. Then louder, stronger. A sound that rolled across the valley like an approaching freight train, but slower, deeper. Wrong. Ranger bolted down the steps and ran to the hillside shelter, barking sharply. Once, twice, 3 times. A signal, a command. Ethan didn't hesitate. He followed Ranger to the trench, heart pounding, breath sharp in his chest. The world dimmed as a wall of gray swept down the ridge. Snow, wind, and something else hidden inside the swirling mass. Storm wasn't supposed to hit for 2 more days, Ethan muttered as he descended into the shelter. Weather Service didn't say anything like this. Ranger barked again, urgent, insistent. Ethan ducked into the main chamber, lighting the lantern he kept near the entrance. The flame flickered violently as wind whistled through the beams above, but the structure held. Relief washed over him. Then the world outside exploded. A violent gust slammed into the hillside, sending loose snow and dirt cascading past the entrance. The sound mimicked the rumble of distant explosions. Not identical, but close enough to make Ethan flinch. His body reacted before his mind could stop it. Flash, noise, shaking earth. His pulse skyrocketed. His vision blurred around the edges. Ranger rushed to his side, pressing against him, guiding him through the panic with gentle pressure and steady breathing. Training etched into the dog's very bones. Ethan inhaled shakily. "Not there," he whispered. "Not again. Stay here. Stay present." Ranger leaned harder until Ethan's trembling eased. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the earth shuddered. Loose clumps of dirt fell from the ceiling, though the beams held strong. Ethan positioned himself under the thickest support frame, Ranger planting himself shoulder to shoulder. "It's okay," Ethan murmured, not sure if he was speaking to Ranger or himself. "We reinforced everything. We planned for this." But the storm didn't sound like a Montana winter squall. It sounded alive, chaotic, almost predatory. For hours, the storm battered the valley. The wind roared in unpredictable bursts. Snow slammed against the hillside with such force Ethan could feel the vibrations through the ground. The temperature plunged so fast that frost formed along the shelter's timber frame. Ranger stayed on high alert, ears twitching, head lifting at every shift in the wind. "Mother Nature's angry," Ethan whispered, "and no one up there is ready for it." He imagined the fragile roofs on Timber Ridge, the old chimneys, the loose siding on barns and sheds. He thought of Linda Sharp, Sheriff Collins, even Mark Jensen. None of them believed danger was coming. None of them prepared. But Ranger had known, and now the valley was paying for ignoring a warning they couldn't understand. As afternoon faded into a dim gray twilight, the storm only worsened. The wind howled so fiercely it mimicked the distant wail of sirens. Long, rising, falling. Sounds that pulled Ethan's mind dangerously close to memories he fought to bury. He pressed a hand against Ranger's back. "Stay with me." Ranger nudged his chin, grounding him again. Hours passed. The lantern flickered. Outside, the storm raged, relentless. The shelter trembled under the fury of the wind, but it held firm, just as Ethan designed it to. By nightfall, the storm had erased all sound except its own. No coyotes, no owls, no distant ranch dogs barking across the valley. Just the blizzard, the choke of wind, the never-ending roar. Then, amid the chaos, Ethan heard something else. A faint thud, soft, muffled, almost lost in the storm's fury. Ranger's head snapped toward the entrance. Thud, thud, thud. Someone, something, was pounding on the shelter door. Ethan's blood ran cold. "No one should be out in this," he whispered. Ranger growled low, not aggressive, but alert, concerned. Ethan grabbed the lantern and moved toward the entry tunnel. Wind shrieked against the wooden barrier, rattling it against its hinges. Then he heard it, through the roar of the storm. A voice. A weak, desperate voice. "Please, open, please." Ethan froze. Ranger whined, pushing forward beside him. Ethan's heart slammed in his chest. His hand shook on the doorknob. Someone had found their way to his shelter. Someone who shouldn't have been able to survive out there. And it wasn't just one voice. Another joined it. And another. Faint, breaking, begging. Ethan's breath hitched as he braced himself. The storm had arrived. And so had the first survivors. The pounding at the shelter door grew more frantic. 3 dull hits, then a pause, then 2 more, weaker this time. Wind screamed down the tunnel, carrying the sound like a cry swallowed by snow. Ethan lifted the lantern higher, its flickering light trembling against the earthen walls. Ranger pressed forward, nose at the wooden door, tail low, body tense. Not fearful, alert, ready, aware. He turned his head toward Ethan and gave a short, urgent bark. "All right," Ethan whispered, hand resting on the latch. "I hear them." Another voice rose above the wind, thin, cracking. "Help! Please!" Ethan unlatched the door, bracing his shoulder against the force of the storm pushing back. When the door cracked open, a blast of snow exploded into the passage, swallowing the lantern's glow for a moment. Ranger pressed into Ethan's leg to steady him. Through the swirling white, 3 shadowy figures stumbled forward, hunched, shaking, barely upright. "Get inside, now!" Ethan shouted over the wind. Mark Jensen collapsed through the doorway first, half carrying, half dragging his wife, her face pale and rimed with frost.
Their 8-year-old son, Dylan, clung to Mark's coat with hands that didn't seem to work anymore. Ethan slammed the door shut behind them, cutting off the roar of the storm. The silence inside felt heavy, broken only by gasps and chattering teeth. Ranger immediately went to the child, nudging him gently, trying to keep him awake. Dylan's eyes were glazed, barely tracking movement. Ethan took Mark's arm. "Sit, now." Mark didn't argue. He dropped to the ground, breathing hard. His wife slumped beside him, trembling. Ethan grabbed blankets from the supply crate and wrapped the family quickly. "How long were you out there?" Mark shook his head, dazed. "Roof caved in. I tried to get the truck started, but it froze.
Engine wouldn't turn. We saw light from your chimney vent. Thought it had to be you." Ranger settled beside Dylan, pressing his warm body against the boy's legs, instinctively knowing where warmth mattered most. Dylan let out a weak sound, leaning into the dog. "He's warm," he whispered. "He'll keep you that way," Ethan said softly. Mark looked up, eyes wide with shame and realization. "Ethan, we wouldn't have made it if you hadn't built this." But Ethan shook his head. "Save your strength. This storm isn't done." Before he could say more, Ranger's head jerked toward the door. A new sound. Not knocks. Pounding. Desperate, uneven, almost frantic. Ranger barked once, loud and sharp. Ethan grabbed the lantern again. "Stay with them," he said to Ranger automatically. But Ranger ignored that command, planting himself at Ethan's side as they moved toward the entry. The pounding grew harder. Voices, too, multiple, tangled in fear. "Please, please open! Someone! Anyone!" Ethan didn't waste a second. He shoved the door open, fighting the storm as it shoved back. 6 more figures tumbled into the tunnel. 2 ranch hands he recognized from the Tanner property. An older prospector who often wandered the woods, and a woman clutching a bundled infant to her chest. Snow plastered their hair, eyebrows, shoulders. Their faces were ghostly pale. Ethan slammed the door shut again, breath heaving. Ranger darted toward the woman with the baby, sniffing urgently, then looking at Ethan with a sharp whine.
"He's cold," she gasped. "I tried to keep him warm. I tried."
Ethan guided her deeper into the shelter. The baby's lips were faintly blue, but he stirred when Ranger nosed his cheek gently. "He's alive," Ethan said. "We'll warm him up." The room filled quickly, 10 people now, huddled together, shivering, crying softly as their bodies remembered heat. Ethan distributed blankets, set extra logs into the small underground fireplace, and heated broth in a pot over the grate. Mark watched Ethan move from person to person, steady and precise, never panicked, never unsure. "You were ready for this," Mark said quietly. Ethan didn't answer. He knelt beside an older man whose fingers had turned dangerously pale, rubbing them to restore circulation.
Only Ranger responded, leaning against Ethan's side, grounding him. The storm hammered the hillside above, the sound vibrating through the shelter beams like distant thunder. Snow smothered the world outside, erasing the town, the roads, the fences, everything. Inside the shelter, 10 lives clung to warmth that shouldn't have existed under such fury. At one point, the infant stopped crying. His mother panicked, her breath catching. But Ranger stepped forward, pressing the side of his body along the child's small frame, lending him heat. The infant let out a faint whimper, thin, but alive. The mother sobbed with relief. "Thank you. Oh, thank you." Ethan touched Ranger's head. "Good work, buddy." Hours passed. The fire glowed steady. The air warmed enough for breath not to sting.
But fear lingered in every exhausted face. The storm raged on. Mark eventually sat forward, staring at Ethan through eyes that had lost their pride. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "About you. About this. About everything." Ethan met his gaze without judgment. "Storms don't care who's right." Mark nodded slowly. "But you saved us." Ethan looked around the crowded chamber, 10 people alive because a man and his dog had built something no one believed in, something everyone mocked. Ranger rested beside him, eyes tired but alert, chest rising and falling with steady breaths. Ethan ran a hand over Ranger's fur and whispered, "You knew they'd come, didn't you?" Ranger blinked once, slow and certain. Above them, the storm screamed into the night. Inside, for the first time since the world went white, everyone had a chance to live. But survival inside a crowded underground shelter came with its own kind of battle. One fought not with weapons or enemies, but with fear, exhaustion, and the cold that seeped into bones the moment the fire dimmed. Ethan kept feeding the small stone hearth, its steady glow painting the earthen walls in flickering gold. The flames were weak compared to the blizzard raging overhead, but down here, they meant life. The 10 rescued neighbors huddled together on rugs and blankets Ethan had laid down weeks before. The prospector, Jenkins, sat near the wall sipping hot broth in trembling hands. The Tanner ranch hands shared a blanket, their boots still rimed with ice. Sarah Cross, the woman who arrived with the infant, rocked her baby close, whispering prayers into the soft crown of his head. Ranger checked each person one by one, nudging them gently, warming them with his body whenever someone shivered too hard. He moved with practiced instinct, the same calm presence Ethan had relied on countless times overseas. Even now, Ranger understood which humans needed him most. Ethan paused beside the fire, rubbing his sore shoulders. "We'll get through this," he said quietly, not sure if he was speaking to the people or himself. A loud crack echoed above them, followed by the thud of snow shifting violently down the hill. Several people gasped. Dylan Jensen bolted upright with a small cry. Ranger was at the boy's side instantly, resting his chin on Dylan's knees until the child's breathing slowed. "Is the hill going to collapse?" one of the ranch hands asked, voice shaking. "No," Ethan answered firmly. "The supports are solid. That sound was snow settling. Happens in storms like this." Mark Jensen looked at him with a mixture of trust and shame. "You sure?" Ethan met his eyes. "If this place wasn't safe, we wouldn't be in it." Mark nodded slowly, gripping his wife's hand. But even Ethan wasn't entirely sure. The storm had grown louder than he imagined possible. Wind hit the hillside with the force of rolling boulders. Snow battered the earth overhead in relentless waves. He checked the ceiling beams again, pressing his hand against the timber, feeling for vibrations.
The wood held strong, tight, steady, unmoving. Ranger sat behind him, watching him check every beam. The dog's eyes followed Ethan with quiet concern, mirroring his tension. "Good boy," Ethan whispered. "We built this right." Hours crawled by with no sense of time except the fading lantern flame and the shifting fire. People drifted between restless sleep and wakefulness. The storm raged on. Close to dawn, a sudden cry pierced the shelter. Sarah's baby. Ethan rushed over. The infant's tiny chest rose in shallow, irregular breaths. His skin had taken on a pale tone from the cold that clung to the air even with the fire burning. I don't know what to do," Sarah whispered, tears welling. Ethan knelt beside her. "He's cold.
"We need to warm him fast." Ranger stepped forward, positioning himself beside the mother and child. Gently, Ethan placed the baby between Ranger's front legs, letting the dog curl around the tiny body. Ranger lowered his head, warming the infant with calm, steady breaths. Within minutes, the baby whimpered, a soft, fragile sound that broke the tension like light through clouds. Sarah sobbed in relief. "Bless you. Bless your dog." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. He knows what to do. Ranger's instinct to save life never left him, not the battlefield, not the training field, not here in the middle of a Montana blizzard. He was built for this. His purpose didn't end when the war did. As the infant regained steady breathing, the shelter settled back into a fragile quiet. The storm was still monstrous, but inside, the fire held strong, and Ranger's presence kept the fear from swallowing everyone whole. Ethan finally allowed himself to sit against the far wall, exhaustion washing over him in a slow wave. The hours of digging, the stress, the memories clawing at the back of his mind, all of it pressed down on him. Ranger walked over, sat beside him, and rested his head in Ethan's lap. Ethan stroked his fur. "I don't know how I'd survive any of this without you." Ranger closed his eyes, breathing steady and slow. Mark Jensen approached after a long silence. "Ethan, I owe you an apology. A real one." His voice cracked around the edges. "I've said some things I had no right to say." Ethan looked down at Ranger, then back at Mark.
You said what you believed. I believed wrong." Mark's throat tightened. "If you hadn't built this, my boy wouldn't be alive right now. Ethan didn't speak. Mark didn't need forgiveness. He needed grace. And tonight, Ethan had enough of it to spare. Another violent blast of wind shook the shelter, reminding them that the storm was far from done. Snow hammered the hillside again, but the beams held. The fire flared. Ranger lifted his head, ears perked, alert but not alarmed. The storm would not get the best of them. Not here. Not tonight. As the hours passed, the shelter grew warmer. Human breath mingled with the fire's heat. Blankets and body warmth filled the space with a quiet resilience.
Ranger remained awake when Ethan couldn't, watching over every shivering neighbor, standing guard beside every frightened child. By the time the firewood stack had dwindled by half, Ethan rose again and fed more logs into the hearth. "Just a little longer," he whispered to the flames. The storm clawed at the earth above them, furious and unrelenting. But inside the shelter Ethan built, inside the walls Ranger kept warm, life continued. For 48 hours, they lived not because of luck or chance or timing, but because Ethan Walker had listened to the only warning that mattered, the one his dog understood before any human ever could. The second night in the shelter was quieter, though the storm still raged above them with a fury that made the earth tremble. The fire crackled low in the stone hearth, sending ribbons of warm light dancing across the packed dirt walls. Exhaustion had settled on everyone like a heavy blanket. Even fear, after so many hours, had grown dull around the edges. But not for Ethan. He sat against the wall, Ranger's head resting across his thigh. The dog slept lightly, muscles twitching now and then, ears flicking at the smallest sound. Ethan kept a hand buried in Ranger's fur, steadying himself with the warmth and rhythm of the dog's breathing. Mark Jensen sat nearby, elbows on his knees, staring into the fire with hollow eyes. His wife dozed beside him, and Dylan slept curled beneath Ranger's outstretched paws. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Mark broke the silence. "Ethan." His voice was rough. "Why did you build this? I mean, really. You didn't do this for fun, or paranoia, or because you thought winter might be a little rough." Ethan didn't react right away. He kept his hand moving slowly along Ranger's back. Mark leaned forward. "What made you do it? What did you know that we didn't?" The others looked up, Jenkins, the ranch hands, Sarah with her baby. Even those asleep stirred, sensing the tension of truth hovering in the air. Ethan took a breath. The kind of breath a man takes when he's about to open a door he's kept shut too long. "I didn't build this because of what I knew," he said quietly. "I built it because of what I remembered." Ranger lifted his head, pressing it gently against Ethan's ribs, as if bracing him. Ethan stared into the fire, the flickering flames reflecting in his eyes. "It was during my last deployment," he began. "Not long before Ranger and I came home. We were sweeping a village after a sandstorm had buried half the roadways. Everything was unstable. The buildings, the hillsides, even the air felt wrong. A heavy silence settled. No one moved. We were inside a small structure," Ethan continued, "just doing a routine check. The wind outside sounded like it was tearing the world apart. Ranger was tense, more than usual. I didn't think much of it. Dogs get uneasy. But then he did something he never did before." Ranger's eyes stayed on Ethan, as if reliving it with him. "He stood between me and the doorway," Ethan said softly. "Wouldn't let me move forward. He kept pushing his head into my stomach, growling. Not angry, not scared. Warning." Mark whispered, "Like he did here." Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah, exactly like here." The fire cracked, and Ethan's voice dropped lower. I took one step past him. One. And then the whole building came down. Gasps rippled through the group. The wind had weakened the walls. Sand filled the foundations. The ceiling dropped so fast I didn't even have time to react. Would have crushed me on the spot, except... His voice tightened. Except Ranger grabbed my vest and dragged me backward before the roof hit the floor. Then he dug until my team found us. He saved my life. Not because of training, because he sensed something none of us did. Sarah wiped at her eyes. The prospector bowed his head.
Even the ranch hands stared at the floor, humbled.
Ethan looked at each of them. When Ranger started acting strange these past few days, when he watched the ridge, paced the porch, barked at nothing I could hear, I knew it wasn't nothing. I've learned to listen to him. Mark swallowed. And we didn't. No, Ethan said gently. But I didn't build this to prove anything. I built it because I wasn't going to let another roof fall on us. Not ever again. Ranger leaned into him, warm and steady. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's neck. He's been saving me for years. So when he told me a storm was coming, when he told me we needed to be underground, I listened. A long silence filled the chamber after that. Heavy but soft.
The storm howled above them, shaking the hillside as if trying to claw them out of the earth. Yet inside the shelter, something shifted. Something unspoken. Something deep. Respect. Understanding. Gratitude. Mark's voice cracked. We laughed at you. At him. All of us did. Ethan looked at him, not with resentment, not with anger, but with the calm of a man who had learned to carry more than words. You didn't know, Ethan said simply. The fire popped, sending sparks up the flue. Ranger laid his head back on Ethan's lap, eyes closing again. Outside, the wind screamed its fury, but the shelter stayed strong. Sarah rocked her baby gently. If it weren't for this place, for you and Ranger, my son. Her voice broke. Ethan shook his head.
Thank him, he murmured, resting a hand on Ranger's shoulder. He's the one who felt the danger. I just followed. But the prospector, Jenkins, old, weathered, quiet, spoke for the room. You followed, Jenkins said, when every other man up there ignored the warnings. He nodded toward Ranger. That dog may have sensed it, but you listened, and that's why we're alive. Ethan lowered his gaze, humbled, overwhelmed, exhausted. The storm outside roared louder, but inside the shelter the air felt warmer than before, not from the fire, but from truth spoken aloud. In that moment, as the wind shook the earth and snow buried the valley above, something finally broke inside Ethan, not in pain, but in release. For the first time since he'd returned home, he wasn't the man running from memories. He was the man who built a refuge, the man who listened, the man who saved others because one loyal dog had saved him first. And for the first time in a very long time, he believed he had done something right. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the room sat in reverent silence. No one mocked him now. No one doubted him now. Ethan Walker and Ranger had given 10 people a second chance at life, and by morning, all of Timber Ridge would know it. The storm didn't end so much as it began to fade, slowly, reluctantly, like a wild animal deciding it had done enough damage for one night. By early morning, the roar above the shelter softened into a distant growl. Snow still pressed on the earth overhead, but the violent tremors finally eased. Inside the shelter, people stirred from light, uneasy sleep. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows on the earthen walls. Frost clung stubbornly to the tunnel entrance, but warmth still held inside, stubborn, steady, alive. Ethan stretched his stiff back as he stood, joints cracking audibly. Ranger rose with him, shaking out his fur, sending small flecks of dust into the air. The dog sniffed the ceiling, ears rotating like radar dishes, taking in a new signal. "Storm's letting up," Ethan murmured. Ranger gave a soft huff of agreement. Mark Jensen pushed himself upright, rubbing his face with both hands. "I can't believe we made it," he said, voice raspy. His wife leaned against his shoulder, their son still curled beneath a blanket at their feet.
Sarah Cross rocked her baby gently, whispering into his ear. "It's warmer," she said, almost in awe. "Feels like the storm finally ran out of breath." Jenkins, the old prospector, lifted his lantern, squinting at the walls. "This place held," he said. "Held better than most houses up there, I reckon." Ethan checked each support beam again, palms pressing against the timber. No shifts, no cracks, no groans of strain. Ranger followed behind him, tail swaying with cautious relief. "You built this right, son," Jenkins said softly. Ethan exhaled, a long, shaky breath that felt like the first true breath he'd taken in days. "I just wanted us to survive." Mark rose and stepped toward him. His eyes, usually sharp with stubbornness, held something different now. Respect. Humility. Gratitude so deep, it softened his entire posture. "Ethan," Mark said quietly, "if you hadn't done this, if you hadn't listened to your dog, my boy wouldn't be alive." Ethan looked at Dylan, who sat stroking Ranger's head with small, grateful hands. "Ranger warned me," Ethan said. "I just followed." Mark shook his head. "Plenty of folks hear warnings and do nothing. You did something." Ranger nudged Ethan's knee, as if echoing the sentiment. A sudden thud reverberated above them, snow sliding off the hill in a heavy cascade. Everyone tensed until Ranger remained calm, his tail relaxed. Only then did the group breathe again. "Storm's shifting," Ethan said. "We need to check outside, but we'll do it slowly. No one leaves until I'm sure the entrance isn't blocked." He moved toward the tunnel, Ranger at his heel. They cleared frost from the edges of the door. Ethan pressed his shoulder into it and pushed. At first it didn't budge, packed snow forcing it closed, until Ranger jumped beside him and braced his front paws against the wood. Together, they pushed again. The door gave way with a crunching groan, opening to a world transformed. The valley was buried. Snowdrifts towered like frozen waves, some nearly high as rooftops. The sky, however, was clear, an icy, unapologetic blue. Sunlight glittered across the endless white, making the world look deceptively beautiful. Ethan stepped out carefully. Ranger bounded forward, then stopped abruptly, nose pressed into the wind. He scanned the horizon, muscles twitching. Not in alarm, in assessment. The storm was over, but the aftermath had only begun. As the survivors climbed from the shelter, awe spread across their faces. Houses in the distance sagged, roofs bowed under the weight of snow. Smoke no longer rose from many chimneys. The world was silent, except for the groan of settling ice. Dylan clung to Ranger's fur, whispering, "We're alive." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. "This place, this shelter, it saved us." Ethan looked at the hill. His hill, the one everyone mocked. Not anymore. Mark placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You're not crazy," he said firmly. "You're a damn hero." Ethan shook his head. "I'm just a man who listened to the right voice." Mark smiled through chapped lips. And that dog, he's 1 in a million. Ranger barked once, as if acknowledging the compliment. News didn't spread slowly in Timber Ridge. By midday, neighbors trudging through the snow reached the shelter site. Some carried shovels, others carried injured pets. Some carried nothing but fear in their eyes. They'd heard the stories. They'd seen the smoke rising from the chimney vent. They came seeking hope. Ethan worked tirelessly, digging paths, helping families check their damaged homes, handing out rations he had stocked for winter, using the shelter to warm anyone who needed it. Ranger guided lost children back to their parents, stayed near the injured, and even alerted Ethan when an elderly neighbor collapsed in the snow. Word traveled fast. Ethan Walker saved 10 people. That shelter is the only reason the Jensens are alive. His dog warned him. His dog saved all of them. By evening, the mayor herself trudged through the drifts to shake Ethan's hand, tears frozen to her lashes. "We owe you more than we can say," she told him. "When this is over, you have to teach the town how to build shelters like yours." Ethan blinked, surprised. "Me?" "You and Ranger," she corrected with a smile. "Looks like we all have something to learn from the two of you." Ranger sat proudly at Ethan's side, tail sweeping the snow. Later, when the sun dipped and the air grew still again, Ethan and Ranger walked up the rise behind the shelter. The wind brushed gently over them, no longer violent, just crisp, cold, familiar.
Ethan knelt beside Ranger. "We did good, buddy." Ranger leaned into him, warm and steady. But then Ethan noticed something, Ranger favoring his back leg, a limp, subtle but real. "Ranger?" Ethan whispered. He examined the leg gently. A strain, a bruise. Maybe from pushing through snowdrifts the night before. Maybe from shielding Dylan. Maybe from bracing the shelter door against the storm. Ethan's throat tightened. "You got hurt saving us." Ranger leaned forward, resting his head against Ethan's chest. The gesture nearly broke him. "You didn't just warn me," Ethan whispered. "You carried us through this." Below them, the survivors gathered near the shelter, looking up at the man and the dog who had become symbols of hope in a valley buried by winter.
Timber Ridge would rebuild, because Ethan Walker had listened, and because Ranger had understood before anyone else. Ethan wrapped an arm around Ranger, holding him close as the snow glowed gold in the late sun. "I owe you everything," he murmured. "More than you'll ever know." Ranger closed his eyes, letting Ethan hold him. And for the first time since the war, Ethan didn't feel broken. He felt whole, because he hadn't just survived the storm, he had conquered it. With Ranger. Always with Ranger. If you felt something in this story, even just a moment that stayed with you, let me know by dropping a simple comment like 0 or 1 down below. It's quick, it's easy, and it tells me you want more stories like this. And if you'd like to follow Ethan and Ranger through more journeys of courage, survival, and loyalty, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring the next chapter to life. I'll see you in the next story.